Okay, let's start. Good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to present John Mills. He's a philosopher. He's professor of psychology and psychoanalysis at the Graduate Professional School in Toronto. And he won the Gravita Award winner. He's the author and editor of more than 20 books, including Humanizing Evil, Psychoanalytic, Philosophical and Clinical Perspective, edited with Ronald Nassau in 2016. He's a member of the IAGS Executive Committee and IAGS IJJS Liaison Person. You are very welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. Honored. Well, since I'm here in Frankfurt, where the famed Frankfurt School of Critical Theory originated, and where Axel Honneth is the director of the Institute for Social Research, it's only fitting that I shall attempt to offer an adumbrated critique of critical theory through psychoanalytic sensibility. And given that Hegel's house is only 2 hours away in Stuttgart, which I plan to visit, by the way, it's only proper that I pay homage to his psychological insights, given that he portended psychoanalysis in so many important ways, including anticipating the unconscious. While Freud knew very little of Hegel's philosophy, Jung read his works. He was not a fan. Jung thought Hegel was, quote, grandiose when talking about spirit. I wonder if this is because Hegel had tread too close to home, hence threatening Jung's originality when he postulated a collective unconscious. After all, Geist emerges from an unconscious abyss only to find itself as the culmination of pure self-consciousness, the coming into being of psychic presence. Honneth has advanced Hegelian thought in many noteworthy ways, including turning to Winnicott. However, considerations from psychoanalytic practice suggest that his recognition theory depends upon an overly optimistic view of human nature. This is especially clear in the case of social collectives, not to mention governments, who regularly fail to interact through reciprocal recognition, even when they become aware of their mutual dependency on one another. For instance, people often acquiesce to others for defensive reasons, especially when they're afraid, rather than because they recognize them as being equals. Submission to another's will typically thwarts the probability of the other's aggression being directed toward them, hence protecting the self. This observation equally applies to Habermas's theories of moral consciousness, commutative action, and discourse ethics, which presupposes that human beings by nature are rational animals, and that through linguistic dialogue, societies can reinvigorate Enlightenment paradigms of social justice free from denomination from others, based upon cooperative speech exchange. In particular, Habermas's theory of commutative rationality assumes that norms, rules, and procedures for communication and argumentation can be established in the moral practical realm and have a rational outcome by necessity, when this seems to ignore the non-rational, desirous, emotional, prejudicial, political, and unconscious motivations that govern human discourse and action. From a psychoanalytic point of view, this is unrealistic, if not a wishful fantasy, since it is evident that collectives are largely possessed by unconscious complexes, emotional seizures, attitudinal prejudices, and irrationality, to the degree that unadulterated reason is not even remotely possible, let alone valid. Such highly rationalized accounts of human relations seem to ignore basic psychological dynamics of human motivation based in neurotic propensities, affect dysregulation, dispositions toward aggression, and internal conflict that militates against any pure cognitivist paragon. Critical theorists have not fully appreciated the insights of psychoanalytic perspectives that deviate from overtly sanguine views valorizing anthropological conditions leading to optimally cohesive social arrangements. To explore the limits of Hanna's position that world societies can achieve reciprocal recognition, I wish to examine the dark side of recognition, namely its asymmetrical pathological dynamics. Throughout this presentation, I'll explore these basic dynamics and how they are informed by early developmental contingencies in attachment, self-formation, object relations, and negation of difference, addressing the psychodynamics of how dysrecognition and refutation of the other lead to insidious pathologies within society and the clinic. Critical theory has traditionally been concerned with the broader social fabric of institutionalized cultural practices that inform a collective ethos, with a keen eye on analyzing dysfunction and advocating for real changes in society. This includes critiquing authoritarian politics, safeguarding against totalitarianism, democratizing social justice, and extending an ethical hand in our post-Holocaust world. This shift in social self-consciousness stresses the importance of validating alterity rather than sustaining rival differences between individuals, societies, and nations that fail to acknowledge the need for mutual recognition of the other. But in today's climate, the Hegelian master-slave dialectic seems to be very much alive. Most developing and non-industrial countries live in servitude to powerful others or the state, and in democratic nations, citizens are largely dependent upon capitalistic enterprises for which they serve and enrich. In fact, subjugation and denomination of otherness is flourishing throughout the globe. Entire peoples are vanquished, refuted, nullified, and denounced simply because they proclaim to have different needs and worldviews. When difference and protest persist, they are often overpowered and persecuted under the guise of resistance to conformity to the prevailing forces that enslave them in their actual conditions of oppression. Our attachments to others, people relations, not object relations, and intersubjective communal matrices form the psychological edifice of our dependency on others and social institutions organized around just and unjust modes of recognition that are structurally, systemically, and semiotically constituted. When these basic bedrock of relationality is disrupted or vitiated, society experiences anxiety, emotional pain, and retrograde backlash. Individuals, social groups, and civilizations that are victimized by repeated dysrecognition and base negation of their values and collective identities are subjected to a cultural pathos against their will. As a result, we suffer. Arguably, one of the most widely cited sections of the phenomenology of spirit is Hegel's discussion of lordship and bondage. In pithy form, spirit or mind, Geist, ultimately achieves ethical self-consciousness only by recognizing the other as an equal being. But this is a developmental achievement. In our intersubjective engagement with others, there is a battle for recognition that takes place between subjects. Yet at first, parties in the struggle are unaware that they are looking for recognition, which is unconsciously mediated, hence the meaning of which is initially unclear to those involved. It is only through the process of confronting otherness that we become cognizant of what we truly want. We may observe how this is ontically infused in all spheres of life and plays a key role in our psychological health and social progress. For every human being wants to be recognized by others as an instantiation of human desire. This naturally extends to society. Before society raises itself to the status of improving its cultural practices for the sake of its peoples, including institutionalized ethics, law and order, and distributive justice, it must start with this basic psychic fact. Those who are deprived of recognition fail to thrive, just as infants abandoned to orphanages, who are given no nurturance, love, or human touch. In days of serfdom and feudalism that existed in the High Middle Ages, people were ruled by autocracy and aristocracy, of which recognition was merely a one-way relation. The governing lord was recognized, and the serf did the recognizing. In fact, this was a matter of life or death. Fear and despair kept one alive by obedience and subservience to a potentially cruel master. Hegel believes the struggle over being acknowledged is a necessary one in order to be truly independent and free, as the odyssey of self-consciousness, that is social awareness, is a progressive unfolding of recognizing its own ethical nature, unified in self-knowledge as a higher truth and culmination of civilized social life. In other words, true recognition by society requires collective reason and action where all people are seen, theoretically and pragmatically, as equal, hence comprising and participating in and of a society, or the state, harmonized in egalitarian principles, and as such constitutes the will of the people. But this is not the case for all societies. As we may plainly see in our world governed by violence, chaos, proto-fascism, dictatorship, despotism, and oppression of the masses, absolute self-consciousness, namely enlightened society, remains merely an abstract ideal, especially for non-democratic nations. Regardless of the limits of human societies, within today's climate of globalization failing to unite individuals, ethnic groups, and disparate cultures in a collective ethos, Hegel's theory of recognition has tangible, applied, concrete merits. In fact, the problem of recognition may constitute the majority of our world ills today. From the cradle to the grave, a child wants love, emotional attunement, validation, and acceptance that only a parent can afford, as well as forgiveness for their imperfections, just as a parent wants reciprocal acknowledgement for their role in raising their child, as well as forgiveness for their imperfections, even in the final moments while lying in their deathbed. This speaks to a universal theory of human nature. So why does most of the world live in negation of this collective need, where radical splitting is instituted and alterity signals the proclivity to deny, withhold, aggress upon, and deracinate the other? Although this phenomenon is complex and overdetermined, let us return to basics using Hegel as our guide. People are unreflectively seen as being mere objects, as things that exist out there in the world. Because they are divorced from our emotional and personal lives in order for us to psychologically function. I mean, we'd all be basket cases if everyone we see and encounter is to be valued as much as anyone else. It's only when we contemplate the nature of this otherness that we are confronted with our own normativity. Others are and have a self that exists independently from me. What is this other? What does the other have that I don't have? What do I want? What do I lack that the other has? These questions lie on the sunrise of self-consciousness, because we are instantly made aware of the external reality of other human beings who are just like us in essence, although we have separate identities, personalities, and longings. We become aware of our desires through reflection upon and as projected onto the other. On the subject that stands before us, even though we see this other as an independent, impersonal object. When we recognize the other as a desirous and intentional being, we are immediately made aware of the subjectivity of the other, one we have an obligation to address. What does this other want? This leads to one of Hegel's most important insights. When we confront otherness, we are entangled in desire and lack. This comes from Hegel, not Lacan, which initiates a skirmish for recognition. Who will be acknowledged in this mutual otherness? Here, subjectivities stand fundamentally opposed to one another. Hegel pushes the issue further and forces us to face a most grave predicament. When mutual opposition confronts each other, quote, each seeks the death of the other, end quote. This understandably creates a crisis situation. Who will be defeated? In our contemporary world of cutthroat competition, economic exploitation and rivalry, political dominion, legal intervention, military strategizing, and transgovernmental maneuvering of hegemonic policies, which ideology will win out over others? One side must acknowledge that they are weaker and the other stronger. So when posturing and rhetoric fail, a natural deference ensues, much like what we see in the animal kingdom, governed by evolutionary currents. One must bow down and accept their inferiority and servitude, while the other maintains the status of victor. What used to be a literal fight to the death is now largely a symbolic one, depending upon where you live or come from. Genocide in Rwanda, Sierra Leone, and the Democratic Republic of Congo are cordial reminders in recent decades of what can happen when powerful differentials implode. But this happens on a more pedestrian plane every day, everywhere in the world. People want respect. When they are diminished, dismissed, or insulted, they emotively react with counter-contempt and rancor, if not narcissistic rage and the need to devalue or shame the other in the heat of the moment. This can even precipitate violence and the need for revenge due to wounded pride. From Wotan to Trump, fake news, and a gullible, inane public, we are living in a precarious times of transition and outright stupidity. What is often recognized is not the equality of the other, but rather a scornful inequality, namely the narcissistic fact that people do not care about alterity over their own lives and self-interests, to the point that the other becomes a dangerous threat to one's safety. Although we may acknowledge that others are independent persons, it does not mean that we, quote, respect others as persons, end quote, Hegel says. On the contrary, respect is earned. Avoidance, withdrawal, submissiveness, on the other hand, are defensive modes of self-survival, especially in the face of a powerful opponent. Do our world societies, what Hegel would call objective spirit, or Jung would call the collective psyche, instantiated in the state, think about the common universal good for all, or merely their own self-regard and political pressures invested in their own nation and communities? Despite there may be checks and balances designed to help treat citizens fairly, this does not generalize to a universal society of cosmopolitans, namely citizens of the cosmos, who value all human life equally. Of course, such hypostatization of a so-called collective mind only makes sense as an abstract conception that embodies the spirit of democracy, as imperfect as this may be. But when it comes down to actualizing a universal good, humanity becomes a multiple personality split in its desires, needs, conflicts, demands, and dissatisfactions. There's always a tension arc between the individual and the collective that stands in relation to pure freedom versus ideality as a good for all. We should never presuppose that we all have the same values and opportunities to pursue and obtain life goals equally, for we all have different historicities and restrictions that condition the developmental, ontic, cultural, material, and economic substrates that in turn curtail our opportunities, liberties, worldviews, and outcomes. So when Hanneth says that a distributional schema of justice, quote, would have to be replaced by the involvement of all subjects in a given relationship of recognition, end quote, this seems to violate human nature. Not all people are disposed, let alone capable, of recognizing the other. We may have to contend that in the end, recognition means tolerance of difference and not merely acceptance of the other, which could still bring about a pragmatic coexistence, even if people cannot recognize each other as equals. In today's society, we live in fear of death for looking at someone the wrong way, of seeing their desire for what you are imagined to possess or what they lack and want, to the point that you could be mugged for the change in your pockets, raped at whim, or shot in the face just because somebody didn't like the way you looked at them. The gaze, the look, the stare is an invitation to aggression. We're instinctively obsequious and show assent or acquiesce when we're afraid. We avoid the face of the other, hence look away, dodge confrontation, and yield. Conversely, just as we look for conflict, seek out a fight, hate the other just for being other, and retaliate in perceived defeat simply because we have the need to find foes. Eye aversion is the best way to evade engaging with the other, simply a faceless entity that is deemed a threat worth avoiding, yet one already identified as a powerful object for inducing fear in the first place. We can sniff out their aggression, their malice, their negativity, and so-called intuitive evil properties. Disavowal and disassociation become common defenses. The other is as alien to us as we are to them, and we hope that they will just leave us alone, if not disappear. In the face of conflict, we simply want the other to vanish. But what happens when the other wants something from us or demands our recognition, let alone restitution, as if it were a right? Our proverbial backs go up. Yet the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, in response to apartheid, the scandal over U.S. Federal Chinese Exclusion Act and interning Japanese Americans in World War II, as well as First Nations children in Christian residential schools in Canada, and the process of family members publicly addressing and sometimes forgiving murderers openly in courts of law, such as with the organization Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation, show how recognition has healing properties. But it does not undo injustice. Inequality and disparities are everywhere. We all have to get in line before we're acknowledged, let alone recognized. Some as subjects in their own right, but mostly as objects wanting something from others, equally viewed as things in mutual opposition. Here the notion of equality by some may be seen as entitlement by others, which challenges the status quo at the same time the establishment offers its own political offenses. We develop our defenses, some stoic and emotionless, others manic and counter-aggressive, in order to deal with the other's demands and in facing our own lack. Envy, jealousy, and passive-aggressiveness are common dispositions. Protest and violence are eruptions of frustration, sometimes fueled by paranoid relations. Facing alterity always involves an interpersonal negotiation between mutual conflict, competing values, emotional prejudices, and privileged self-serving agendas. This takes place in all facets of society, as it does in the consulting room. From Jung to Heidegger and Lacan, we are thrown into a collective psychic matrix and social symbolic order that informs our being in the world. Here the individual develops within the social and the social within the individual. One does not have to bifurcate the arrangements of society from naturalized psychology to see how their dynamic processes and co-occurrences pressurize and inform one another within a systemic unit. We can surely observe how certain structures and political policies within societies lead to more problems in living and suffering in individuals, and how natural psychological processes such as desire, envy, greed, rage, entitlement, aggression, and so on, are intensified and played out through pathological enactments when societies undergo material deprivation, economic austerity, tragedy, trauma, war, political oppression, and so on. When social institutions, capitalistic enterprise, and the populace do not acknowledge or recognize disenfranchised subgroups and the extreme hardships they face due to race, socioeconomic, and educational disparities that privileged classes do not face, social fabrics begin to fray in tatters. The struggle for recognition, as psychoanalysis shows, is present from birth onward, from daycare to death, as each of us are mired in familial, societal, and cultural conflict that saturates our being in the world. The failure to recognize the other, and more insidiously, chronic invalidation and repudiation of different peoples, produces and sustains intersubjective and interethnic aggression to the point of murder and war. Here, the Hegelian struggle for life and death is a lived reality that affects our conception of social justice and institutionalized forms of recognition. But the point I wish to make here is that disrecognition may in fact trigger and sustain violence based on an emotional revolt in reaction to political injustice. Let's call this the fuck you attitude. Indeed, aggression is not only instinctual, for lack of a better word, hence emanating from biological forces, it's also triggered by relational or interpersonal failures at validation and empathy that are sociologically instituted. When such disrecognition is performed and sustained by the state, here we may say that a certain unconscious politics is operative on both the individual and collective level of a given society, which can lead to a vicious cycle of perpetration, victimization, and social malaise that always psychologically penetrates those who are marginalized. And this may be intensified as a post-traumatic act that resurrects earlier psychic pain experienced in childhood, especially when invalidation, abuse, and insecure attachments inform the next generation of social pathologies. Much of psychoanalysis is in simpatico with critical theory in its tacit hopes of bettering society. But psychoanalytic observations can be quite pathologizing as well, and for good reason. Here the two disciplines are critical of the way collectives think and behave. We may speculate that this has to do with, on some level, the way people are raised and taught to think and act in a given cultural milieu. Yet we must begin with rudiments. What do people require psychologically in order to thrive? Beyond recognition, I suggest, and I'm in good company, lies psychic needs for love, validation, and empathy. These are essential for healthy development. When they're lacking, withheld, truncated, or absent, a person and even whole societies may develop a traumatic reaction to life. This notion is quite simple, in fact, a basic ingredient of the human aspect. One of the major roadblocks that derail a discernible intellectual picture of the need for mutual or collective recognition is in deciphering the anathema of unconscious politics that underlie every behavioral act of every person in the world. People, societies, and governments do not act rationally, nor should we expect them to. We do not live in a purely adjudicated intellect or logical universe, but rather one derived from the prisms of our base urges, impulses, emotions, and internal conflicts that must undergo a developmental and educational process of exercising self-constraint, affect regulation, behavioral modification, and instructional training in order to achieve psychological and social maturity. The gleanings of reason, truth, virtue, and wisdom are higher order accomplishments. But this is hardly achieved by everyone. In fact, this level of psychic cultivation is more of an outlier than an actualization for most people. At most, and I'm not talking about this group here, I'm talking about the world population of over 7 billion people. At most, we are striving for the attainment of certain values and ideals. Did I say million? I meant billion. What is more commonplace is that we succumb to our own immediate shortcomings and conflicts, ethical limitations of character, and attitudinal prejudices that condition how we relate to self, others, and the world. We develop internal resistances, oppositions, and counter-struggles to internalized and interiorized conflict from birth onward. This is simply an economic, if not evolutionary, reaction to protecting the self against real or perceived threat and emotional pain. This naturalized tendency is partially derived from, if not somewhat determined by, unconscious desire and its reactionary defenses and resultant disharmonies, fueled by affective currents that merely seek their own resolutions and satisfactions over others, which are projected upon society at large. Here we may observe a basic splitting mechanism in the psyche. Identity and division become irreconcilable where there is no discernible point of synthesis or sublation. People see their own esoteric or group microcosm as the hallmark of truth and reality that takes objective priority over others, when such myopic identifications are in dialectical competition with alterity. In other words, the other is negated in principle based on one's own reinforced preferences that take precedence and are more personally important, the underside of narcissistic hubris. This attitude is the foundation of every country and nationalist or populist movement who values its own citizens over other countries as a pragmatic necessity governing political identificatory self-interest, ranging from every partisan preference and local whim to domestic and foreign decree. We must seriously question the prejudicial unconscious forces that drive political states of affairs, from individual and communal choices to international policy. For collective humanity is neither unified in its aims nor prioritizes matters outside of its immediate scope of parochial concerns or regional inclinations. Is the political unconscious a universal phenomenon? Namely, is it structurally inscribed in the very ontological fabric of the psyche? This would suggest that, with qualifications, notwithstanding divergent groups and individualities that comprise a community of followers identified with attaining certain material gains, enjoyment, or reinforcing a self-serving perspective or worldview, all people are predisposed a priori to favor certain unconscious attitudes, even if they are irrational and ultimately self-destructive. And it is unequivocally taking place on mass scale across all civilized parts of the world. What we are witnessing in concrete forms is how the collective psyche is divided based on unconscious politics identified with certain ideologies fortified by cultural relativity. Here we should question the capacity of collectives to make rationally informed judgments when wish, self-interest, and insular governmental hegemonies make decisions that affect us all. Yet government is elected by the people in democratic countries, which brings us to question why in recent political times the majority of citizens would vote for leaders, say in the United States or the United Kingdom and America, who are anti-environment, anti-immigration, xenophobic, racist, bigoted, religiously intolerant, misogynistic, anti-gay, and pro-war, just to name a few indecencies. From Brexit to the election of U.S. Republican President Donald Trump, humanity should beckon a call to reason. It's no surprise to psychoanalysis that we are witnessing the disintegration of culture, for illogical decisions are unconsciously chosen based upon emotional prejudices, which speaks to the greater manifestation of collective social life immersed in its own pathos. And when I speak of pathos, I am referring to how the ancient Greeks defined the human condition. To be human is to suffer. Now, prejudice, this might not be something that's easy to digest, but prejudice forms a basic constituency in our psychic constitutions. For we all pass judgments on others based on our own preferential appraisal of what we value and are accustomed to find familiar and or pleasing. The dialectical tension between difference and similarity carries a certain psychological hold over people. For our earliest familial identifications are based in shared experiences and values, and we gravitate toward those who we feel attracted to due to communal affiliation and shared meaning. But the double edge of the dialectic, as negativity resulting in higher unity, exposes us to a dilemma. For the dialectic is the ontological dynamic underlying prejudice itself. Here we may be reminded of Adorno. The dark side of the negative is always emphasized in any act of judgment. In fact, it's the structural edifice for judgment to exist. Most societies need to have enemies. That is, they need to have an emotional whipping boy or designated scapegoat to beat and project all of their inner conflicts, frustrations, rage, hate, complexes, homicidal fantasies, and so on onto, or else we would have never invented poetics, theater, drama, the arts, music, religion, politics, and so on. For the human psyche requires forms of displacement and sublimation in order to transform internal discord, affect, and ambivalent experience into palatable outlets so we may psychologically function and adapt to real, perceived, or felt adversity. The reality of racism, ethnic discrimination, inter-ethnic rivalries and hostilities, micro-competitions and devaluations within subcultures and fringe subgroups, and affective prejudices cast onto objects of alterity are all too human universal propensities. To deny them would be an incredulous attempt at posturing political correctness in favor of truth. The mass contempt in many nations for immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and migrant workers of different ethnic and national persuasions, even if only a minority view, speaks to the underground psychic reality of human prejudice, worried that the other will steal their chickens, jobs, sexual partners, and enjoyment. A recent example of this was a mob of over 1,000 South Africans that raided a Somali neighborhood in Pretoria, killing foreign African settlers based on a hate campaign against foreigners, immigrants, and refugees who are accused of creating unemployment and increasing crime. Here the quote foreigner is transferentially constructed as the elected evil other who will mooch, pillage, and soak up the citizens' pleasures and deprive them of their national birthrights and liberties, and who are moreover left flipping the bill for the outsider to enjoy a free lunch. Keep that shit out of my country. This is a common visceral opinion among many American, British, and European communities, to such a degree that the immigrant, migrant worker, or refugee should be deprived of subsidy, welfare, food stamps, unemployment insurance, access to health care, education, daycare, and other privileges just because of their foreign status or so-called lack of entitlement to, quote, free services on the government's dime. Just as a side note, we wouldn't want to live in a world where everyone has a PhD. We need people, to work, to do certain jobs that others are not willing to do, or able to, or could not do, in order to keep the economy functioning and healthy, and to buy real estate and take care of our nation's aging population. Here's a perfect example of our mutual dependency on the other. This exclusionary phenomenon speaks to both the individual and collective rupture of feelings of security and safety that are perceived to be in peril when political changes occur in social strata and potential emergent threats manifest. a paranoid and/or hysterical process that lies at the very heart of human psychological motivations, as it would be illogical not to fear what is unknown and unfamiliar for what is domestic, customary, and familiar. Here the other is categorically, oppositionally constituted, even if there is no discernible threat at all. Difference signifies its own meaning based on dissimilarity, fear, and potential personal loss and sacrifice of a country's members of their own kind. Here the personal idiosyncrasy of selective identification with a certain element of one's culture, language, nationalism, or social complex can wreak political consequences. And even when altruistic and humanistic movements prevail, there's always a spoiler introduced based on human frailty, desperation, and the inevitability of pathological enactments. When German citizens took to protest over the Syrian and North African migrants who allegedly robbed, looted, and sexually assaulted their women after being graciously accepted into the country during the 2015 refugee crisis, which of course happens every day, everywhere, regardless of where you come from. Not to mention several United States governments refusing to allow refugees to settle in their home states once it was discovered that ISIS connections were part of the Paris attacks based upon refugee involvement. It is no surprise why panic would set in and the floodgates would be closed based upon mass protest. These events even sparked President Trump to want to ban Muslims, as everyone knows, from entering the U.S. and to build a wall on the border of Mexico to keep out the, quote, illegal freeloaders. Here it becomes obvious that the alien other, who has their own needs, desires, adversity, and trauma, will likely have their own psychological baggage and material losses that other nations, states will have to pay for. And this is likely how a large percentage of the populace thinks. Why else would people get so emotionally bent out of shape by an influx of new people in their country? The fear of a so-called hard-working citizens supporting and taking care of foreigners on their sweat and taxes, where food, shelter, transport, economic subsidies, and entertainment, such as access to TVs, cell phones, computers, and the internet, are given away without merit, even in the spirit of humanitarian aid, spur bad feelings among the working class and rich alike. Who wants a dependent child when you never wanted to get pregnant to begin with? Part of the problem facing us is that prejudice is ontologically constituted in the most rudimentary aspects of human consciousness as psychological disposition. Like the nature of the dialectic, prejudice has both negative and positive valences. While violence and destruction are the instruments of prejudice, so too is caring and love. Prejudice is not merely a negative construct. Prejudice defines our valuation practices, which are the mecca of individual and communal life. Rather than conceive of prejudice as simply a pathological anomaly, prejudice is also responsible for some of our most revered ideals. As I've stated in a book I wrote over 20 years ago, prejudice is, in its essence, is the preferential self-expression of valuation, as corrupt as that might be. Although it's problematic to make mass generalizations, as I've been trying to provoke people here to think, it may not be entirely illegitimate to say that we largely live in a world where there's no proper recognition of the other as the equiprimordial complementarity of the self. In other words, it's too cognitively overwhelming to uphold the radical Levinasian responsibility to the other over the immediacy of one's life and duties to family and those who we value, as if we could become Jesus and minister to a world collective. This ethical ideal defies logic. real human limitations and the psychological dispositions of the masses. The self is experienced and thought not to be the other. The them is eclipsed for the I, while the we becomes occluded. Here we should maintain no pretense of a pristine Hegelian sublation, or Aufhebung, of the subjective individual within objective social consciousness, where the pinnacle of ethics and justice reach their logical zenith in the concrete universals of culture, for this is merely a theoretical abstraction. In fact, much of social reality resists sublation and can indeed regress or withdraw back to earlier primitive instantiations governed by pathos. The absolute unity of the individual within the social as the logical culmination of pure self-consciousness is simply an illusion, although one that may spur along our continual pining for refining social systems of democracy, law, ethics, and justice. Here, reformation and advance is culture's teleological endeavor. Whatever values and ideals societies adopt, they are always mediated through unconscious psychic processes that condition and taint the collective, as Jung would point out, even when there are good intentions involved. Although the fantasy of wholeness, conceived through Hegel's philosophy of mind as a self-articulated, dynamic, complex holism, arriving at pure unification of the individual within the collective is a noble ideal, a sentiment similar to Jung's notion of individuation, as Mark Sabin very nicely lectured this morning. Such a grand logical synthesis belies the empirical confounds that reflect social reality today, marked by division, fracturing, and splitting of peoples, groups, and nations that radically resist unity. The projection of our aggression, hatred, and destructive envy onto a hating other only ensures mutual conflict and disrecognition, where some compromises conceivably occur. If what we crave and want for ourselves, namely to be acknowledged, validated, and understood, is to be denounced in another as a reciprocal human being, mirroring the inverse of who we are and experience, then this form of negation and hypocrisy not only casts a shadow on the other, but also sullies ourself as an offense to virtue. Yet this idealist language does not inspire mass psychology, which typically devolves into the particular lives, longings, sufferings, and priorities of singular personalities who live among a sea of rivals, all competing for recognition and personal gain. One of the reasons for our impasse in achieving collective recognition of all people is a failure to possess, nurture, and demonstrate empathy for others. This failure is intimately tied to a subset of the problem, that is, our inability to foster global identifications with others. But this is never easy to universally expect, let alone institute or institutionalize on a grand scale. It is an awareness that needs fostered, the seeds of which begin in early childhood, facilitated by a healthy emotional holding environment, grounded in secure attachments to parents, caregivers, and family members or their surrogates. Through personal experiences of being recognized, validated, shown care and psychological warmth, as well as feeling loved and understood, empathy for others develops as self-realization of the good and the need to embrace it, as does our emotional intelligence in socialization practices. Feeling felt, seeing the pain in others' eyes, and recognizing the experience of the other as a reciprocal self-relation to one's own interior helps to open up an ethical stance. We are obliged to extend to the other as a fellow thou, or more appropriately, you, a recognition of personhood. This is a form of ethical self-consciousness as felt compassion that not all people are psychologically capable of harboring or showing based upon their own personal plight or tragedies, family upbringing, cultural displacement or disenfranchisement, developmental traumas, and so forth. But this does not mean that empathy cannot be awakened or taught. If global societies were to promote empathy as an educational imperative and intrinsic valued commodity as an end in itself, institutionalized within a given community or culture, as well as promoting the value of fostering loving emotional attachments to others, which begins in the home, the world would be a better place. But when one is treated like a thing and not recognized as a proper human being, the subject begins to relate to others as things in an ocean of objects, where the kernel of the value of reciprocal recognition devolves into intransigent antagonism, strife, fear of alterity, paranoia, sustained aggressivity, and repetition compulsion. When cultural trauma saturates attachment and socialization patterns, we can assuredly predict a future full of human suffering, where psychic and sociological impairments leave many existential stains. Here we must recognize that the many faces of pathology transfigure our internal natures and scars the social landscape, even when a given individual or society recognizes the collective good in recognizing others.